Ruth Ellis had buried 17 babies in 3 months. Each small grave in Shallow Creek's hardpan earth represented another failure, another mother's scream echoing in her memory. The 18th lay wrapped in her blood-stained apron, no bigger than a loaf of bread, when the Apache emerged from the mesquite shadows, his words cut through the desert silence like a blade through silk. "He is my son now." The shovel trembled in her weathered hands as everything she believed about death, duty, and the natural order crumbled like adobe in a flash flood. The sun hung merciless over Shallow Creek, casting shadows that seemed to mock Ruth Ellis as she knelt beside the freshest mound of earth, her knees pressed into the rocky soil, feeling every stone through her worn calico dress, while her fingers traced the crude wooden cross she had fashioned from mesquite branches. 17 crosses now dotted this makeshift cemetery, each one a testament to her failures as a midwife, each one a child she couldn't save. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that reminded her of the battlefield hospitals back east, where she had first learned that death came in waves, relentless and indifferent. Her medical bag sat open beside her, its leather cracked and stained from 3 years of frontier doctoring. Inside, the instruments that had once seemed so promising now felt like relics of a more hopeful time. The forceps, the laudanum, the clean white bandages, all useless against the harsh realities of childbirth in a land where the nearest real doctor was 2 days' hard ride away. Ruth's hands, once steady enough to thread a needle in lamplight, now trembled with the accumulated weight of loss. She had come west believing she could make a difference, believing her skills learned in the war hospitals would translate to saving mothers and babies on the frontier. The 18th baby lay wrapped in her spare apron, the fabric already stained with the evidence of another failed delivery. Mrs. Henderson had labored for 2 days before the fever took her, leaving behind a husband who couldn't even look at the child that had cost him his wife. The baby had lived for perhaps an hour, long enough for Ruth to feel that familiar stab of hope, long enough for her to whisper promises she couldn't keep. Now the tiny form seemed impossibly small against the vastness of the desert landscape, a fragile testament to the cruelty of this unforgiving land. Ruth rose slowly, her back protesting after hours of digging in the hard earth. The cemetery sat on a small rise overlooking the settlement, where smoke from cooking fires drifted up from adobe houses and canvas tents. Shallow Creek wasn't much of a town, more of a way station for travelers heading deeper into Apache territory, but it was home to perhaps 50 souls, most of them running from something or someone. She had been running too when she first arrived, fleeing the memories of field hospitals and the screams of dying soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had found only more death in this place she had hoped would offer healing. The shovel felt heavier with each grave she dug, as if the earth itself was growing tired of receiving these small offerings. She had learned to dig them deep enough to keep the coyotes away, learned to mark them well enough that the desert winds wouldn't erase them entirely. Each burial was a ritual of defeat, an acknowledgement that her skills, her training, her desperate prayers had once again proven insufficient. The other women in Shallow Creek had begun to whisper that she was cursed, that death followed her like a shadow, and Ruth was beginning to believe they might be right. As she lifted the tiny bundle, preparing to lower it into the grave she had spent the morning digging, Ruth felt the familiar numbness that had become her protection against the endless cycle of loss. She had stopped naming them after the 10th baby, stopped allowing herself to imagine the lives they might have lived. This one would join the others in the hard earth, another small cross in her growing collection of failures, another reason to question why she had ever believed she could heal anything in this broken world. The Apache appeared as if the desert itself had given him form, materializing from the mesquite shadows with the silence of a hunting cat. Ruth's breath caught in her throat as she registered his presence. Tall, lean, with the weathered face of a man who had seen too much of both worlds. His dark hair hung loose to his shoulders, and his clothes were a mixture of Apache buckskin and white man's cotton, marking him as one of those caught between cultures, belonging fully to neither. She had heard whispers of such men in the settlement, renegades who moved like ghosts through the borderlands, trusted by no one, feared by all. Toma, for that was the name the settlers used when they spoke of him in hushed tones, stood perhaps 20 feet away, his dark eyes fixed not on Ruth, but on the small bundle in her arms. There was something in his gaze that made her clutch the dead baby closer to her chest, a protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. She had grown numb to these losses, had taught herself to see them as inevitable, but something in this stranger's presence awakened a fierce guardianship she thought she had lost. The desert wind stirred the sage around them, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of storms. "You bury him wrong," Thomas said, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone speaking in a second language. His English was clear but formal, each word chosen with deliberation. Ruth felt her spine stiffen at the criticism, her grief transforming into defensive anger. She had buried 17 babies with all the dignity she could manage, had spoken words over each grave even when no one else would claim them. This stranger, this Apache who probably saw her as just another white intruder, had no right to judge her methods or her intentions. "I'm burying him with respect," Ruth replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "More respect than anyone else in this God-forsaken place would show." She gestured toward the settlement below, where the smoke from cooking fires seemed to mock the solemnity of the moment. The people of Shallow Creek had grown callous to infant death, treating it as just another harsh reality of frontier life. She alone seemed to carry the weight of each loss. She alone insisted on proper burials and marked graves. Toma took a step closer, and Ruth noticed the way he moved, fluid, purposeful, like water finding its path through stone. His eyes never left the bundle in her arms, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not threat, exactly, but a kind of desperate intensity that made her heart race. "He is my son now," he said simply, the words falling into the desert silence like stones into still water. The statement was so unexpected, so impossible, that Ruth felt the world tilt around her. "Your son?" The words came out as barely a whisper. Ruth stared at this stranger, this Apache who claimed kinship with a white baby born to settlers who would have shot him on sight. The absurdity of it should have made her laugh, but something in Toma's face, a raw vulnerability beneath the stoic mask, stopped her cold. She found herself looking down at the small bundle, seeing not just another failed delivery, but a child this man was claiming as his own. And the weight of that claim settled over her like a heavy blanket, changing everything she thought she understood about death, duty, and the strange mathematics of love. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, each second pulling tighter until Ruth felt something might snap, either the moment or her resolve. Toma's hands remained steady on the small bundle, but she could see the tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes kept darting to the horizon as if expecting riders or ghosts or both. The baby had stopped crying, settling into that peculiar stillness that newborns possessed, as if they understood the gravity of adult decisions better than the adults themselves. Ruth found herself studying the Apache's face, searching for resemblance in the sharp cheekbones, the set of his mouth. But the child's features were too soft, too undefined to tell any story, except the universal one of helplessness. "You can't just take him," she said finally, though her voice carried less conviction than she'd intended. The words felt hollow in the vast emptiness around them, swallowed by wind and distance, and the strange logic of this place where normal rules seemed suspended. She had delivered dozens of babies, had held them in their first moments of life, had wrapped them when they drew their last breaths, but this felt different, like standing at the edge of something she couldn't name. The Apache's claim hung in the air between them, neither question nor statement, but something more dangerous. A declaration that changed the very nature of what they were doing here. Toma's response came slowly, each word measured like precious water in drought country. "White woman's law says many things," he said, his English careful but clear, tinged with an accent that spoke of two languages fighting for space in his mouth. "Says Apache children belong in white schools. Says Apache land belongs to white farmers. Says Apache dead belong in unmarked graves." His eyes met hers directly for the first time, and she saw something there that made her step back. Not anger exactly, but a kind of weary knowledge that felt older than his years. This child has no white law now, no Apache law, only what we choose. The pragmatic part of Ruth's mind catalogued the impossibilities. A lone Apache man with a white infant, traveling through territory where both would be shot on sight by different groups for different reasons. She had seen enough of frontier justice to know how such stories ended, had stitched up enough wounds and closed enough eyes to understand the mathematics of survival out here. But something in Toma's stillness, in the careful way he held the child, suggested he understood these odds better than she did, and had already calculated them into whatever decision he was making. The baby stirred slightly, one tiny fist emerging from the blanket, and both adults looked down, as if the movement might provide some answer to questions they couldn't articulate. "Where will you take him?" Ruth asked, and immediately regretted the question because it implied acceptance of something she wasn't sure she could accept. But the words were out now, hanging in the desert air like smoke signals, and she found herself genuinely curious about this man's plan. Toma shifted the bundle slightly, adjusting his grip with the practiced ease of someone who had held children before, and Ruth wondered about his own story. Whether he had lost family in the endless cycle of raids and reprisals that defined this territory. Whether this strange claim was born from grief or hope or simple human stubbornness. The Apache was quiet for so long that Ruth began to think he wouldn't answer, but then he spoke, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been longing. "There is a place," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the mountains that rose like broken teeth against the horizon, where the old women still remember the songs for welcoming children, where a baby can grow without choosing between being Apache or white, can just be. His words painted a picture that Ruth knew was probably fantasy. Such places didn't exist anymore, if they ever had, but the way he said it, with quiet conviction rather than desperate hope, made her want to believe in impossible sanctuaries and the persistence of ancient kindnesses in a world that seemed determined to forget them. Ruth found herself calculating distances and dangers, her midwife's mind automatically assessing the practical needs of an infant in this harsh landscape. The baby would need feeding every few hours, would need warmth and cleanliness, and the 100 small attentions that kept fragile life from slipping away, and she couldn't see how a man alone, Apache or otherwise, could provide such care while traveling through hostile territory. But even as these thoughts formed, she remembered the gentle competence with which Toma held the child, the way his large hands seemed to know exactly how to support the small head, and she realized her assumptions about men and babies might be as flawed as her assumptions about Apaches and mercy. "He'll need milk," she said, the words emerging before she could stop them, and immediately felt foolish for stating something so obvious. But Toma nodded seriously, as if she had offered crucial information rather than pointing out the fundamental challenge of keeping an infant alive without a mother. "There are goats in the settlements," he said, then paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Or women who have lost children and still carry milk." The observation hit Ruth like a physical blow, reminding her of the countless mothers she had attended who had buried babies, whose bodies continued the cruel joke of preparation for children who would never nurse again. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else, smoke maybe, or just the ghost of yesterday's fires. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter and found herself studying the horizon, looking for the dust clouds that would signal approaching riders. They had been standing here too long, she realized, had let this strange conversation stretch beyond the bounds of safety, but something kept her rooted to this spot, as if the very ground had developed gravity. The baby made a small sound, not quite crying, but a soft murmur of discomfort or need, and both adults looked down with the automatic concern of caregivers, their earlier tension momentarily forgotten in the face of immediate responsibility. "I could help," Ruth heard herself say, and the words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise Toma. She hadn't planned to make such an offer, hadn't even realized she was considering it until the words were already in the air between them. But now that they were spoken, she found she meant them. For a few days, anyway, until you reach wherever you're going. The Apache's eyes searched her face, as if looking for deception or hidden motives, and Ruth realized she wasn't entirely sure of her own reasons, whether this was maternal instinct or professional duty, or simply the human inability to walk away from a story once you'd become part of it. Toma was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Ruth and the bundle in his arms, and she could almost see him weighing risks and possibilities, calculating the odds of survival with and without her help. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been gratitude, though it was mixed with wariness. "White woman traveling with Apache man," he said slowly, "both carrying white baby. Soldiers will shoot first, ask questions after." His words painted a clear picture of the dangers they would face, but also suggested he was considering her offer seriously, was trying to find a way to make the impossible mathematics work. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Ruth of better times, of evenings when the world seemed full of possibility rather than threat. She looked at this strange tableau they had created, a tired midwife, a displaced Apache, and a nameless baby who had somehow become the center of an unlikely alliance, and felt something shift inside her chest, some long frozen part of her heart beginning to thaw, despite her better judgment. "Then we'll have to be very careful," she said, and knew that with those words she had committed herself to a journey she couldn't yet imagine, following a map drawn in hope and desperation across a landscape that forgave no mistakes and offered no guarantees except the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. They began walking as the sun touched the rim of the western mountains, moving with the careful deliberation of people who understood that every step carried them further from the known world into territory mapped only by necessity and faith. Ruth had gathered her few supplies, clean cloth, a small bottle of laudanum, the worn leather bag that held her instruments of birth and death, while Toma fashioned a crude sling from his shirt, creating a carrier that would keep the baby close to his chest and leave his hands free for the rifle he carried with practiced ease. The child seemed to sense the movement, settling into the rhythm of Toma's gait with the adaptability that was perhaps humanity's greatest gift to its youngest members. The landscape around them shifted subtly as they walked, the open desert giving way to broken country where arroyos cut deep scars in the earth and scattered boulders provided both shelter and potential ambush points. Ruth found herself walking slightly behind and to the left of Toma, a position that felt natural despite their lack of discussion about formation or strategy, as if some ancient protocol for traveling dangerous ground had asserted itself without conscious thought. She watched the way he moved, noting the careful placement of each step, the constant scanning of the horizon, the way his free hand never strayed far from his weapon, and realized she was learning a different kind of medicine, the art of keeping life intact in a world determined to extinguish it. "What was his name?" Toma asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the better part of an hour. For a moment, Ruth didn't understand the question, then realized he was asking about the baby, and she felt a strange pang of loss for something that had never existed. "He didn't have one," she said, then added, "His mother died before she could tell me." The words felt inadequate, failing to capture the weight of a life that had ended before it could properly begin, leaving behind only questions and this small breathing proof that love sometimes persisted even when hope failed. Toma nodded, as if this information confirmed something he had already suspected, and Ruth found herself wondering what stories he carried, what losses had shaped his understanding of children without names and mothers, without voices. "In the old way," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, something that might have been reverence. "Children are not named until they show who they are, until they choose their own path." He adjusted the baby's position slightly, his movements gentle and sure, and Ruth realized that whatever else this man might be, renegade, outcast, survivor, he understood something fundamental about the patience required to let life unfold according to its own logic, rather than the demands of a world that wanted everything labeled and categorized and controlled. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when they reached a shallow depression between two low hills, a natural shelter that would hide their fire from distant eyes while providing some protection from the wind that had begun to carry the sharp edge of desert night. Toma set about gathering dried brush with efficient movements while Ruth examined the baby in the fading light, checking for signs of distress or illness, her trained hands moving over the small body with professional thoroughness. The child seemed remarkably healthy, considering his traumatic entry into the world, his breathing steady and his color good, though she knew that could change quickly in an infant so young. As Toma coaxed a small fire to life, Ruth found herself studying his profile in the flickering light, trying to reconcile the gentle competence she had witnessed with the stories she had heard about Apache warriors, the tales of savagery and violence that had shaped her understanding of his people. But watching him now, seeing the careful way he tended the flames and the unconscious protectiveness with which he positioned himself between the baby and the darkness beyond their small circle of light, she began to understand that the stories she had been told were perhaps no more complete than the story she was now living. A story that had no clear heroes or villains, only people trying to survive in a world that offered few easy choices and fewer second chances, finding unexpected grace in the simple act of keeping a small light burning against the vast indifference of the night.